It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. Thank you very much for coming, and congratulations on the weather that you're having in London. You've really been spoiling my kids and me. I think we spent all day in Hyde Park yesterday. It was just amazing. So tonight we'll be talking about gender equality, and we want to in particular focus on what works and also what does not work to close gender gaps. So many of you, I imagine, are here because you care about the absence of women in leadership positions. You might care about this pyramid, which really is replicable, sadly enough, across the world, where we have an increasing fraction of women at the entry level, and then somehow they're disappearing as we are climbing up the career ladder. And that is a real issue. But I do want to suggest to you that really you should care because of something that is much more important. In fact, gender equality, or the lack thereof, can quite literally be a matter of life or death. One of my favorite studies was run by Rob Jensen. He's a development economist now at Wharton, who was interested in studying this problem, a problem that many people think too big to solve, or even to start thinking about, that we might want to coin gendercide. The sex-selective abortion, neglect, and infanticide of girls. This is happening across the world. The UN is now estimating that about 200 million girls are missing from our planet. So what Rob wanted to study was whether providing economic opportunities might affect the survival chances of these girls. Do even the poorest of the poor care about the economic returns of investment? And so here's what he did. He ran a controlled trial in India where he exploited the fact that in the 90s, call centers preferably moved into India and hired many women. He hired a company that provided training services for women to go and work in call centers. And then he was interested in whether, in fact, these women would go and work, but more importantly, he cared about whether this affects how parents treat their daughters. Because now, all of a sudden, there were employment opportunities for women, not thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs, but some jobs. And as you will see throughout my talk, seeing really is believing. And if these parents saw that some women made it, they might actually start treating their daughters differently. And that's exactly what he found. So he had treatment villages and compared them with control villages which didn't get the training or didn't get the treatment, a bit like in the natural sciences, where we give some people the treatment or the medicine and others the placebo, and then can actually measure the impact that the treatment is having. So we're using the very same techniques in the social sciences, and then can find out whether something works or not. In this case here, the happy ending of the story is that it did in fact work, and it had a substantial impact on the lives, on the health, and on the likelihood of being in school of these girls. And interestingly enough, it didn't hurt boys. Sometimes we can do both. Sometimes we can increase equality and also efficiency. But let me now turn back to this country here and talk about Heidi Roizen. Heidi Roizen, this country here, this was a US bias. I totally apologize for that. The Western world, this is Heidi Roizen, she's actually an American. You'll see it's going to get even more American. She's from Silicon Valley. Heidi Roizen is a real person. She's a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. And she's interesting for many reasons. She's a very successful businesswoman. But for the purposes of tonight, she is interesting because a colleague of mine wrote a case about her. So many of you are Harvard graduates or went to graduate school someplace else and have encountered these case studies, detailing what a leader has done, for example, to grow her business, to network, etc. It became more interesting because a few years later, some other colleagues then took this case and replaced Heidi's first name by Howard. And they then gave half of their students the same case with the female protagonist being Heidi, the real person, and the other half of their students with the protagonist becoming Howard. And then they asked how we feel about Heidi and Howard. Do they do a good job? Are they competent? Do we like them? Would we hire them? And it turns out that everyone thinks they are competent and do a good job, but we don't like Heidi. We wouldn't want to hire her, we wouldn't want to work with her. And that applies to both male and female students. Why is that? Heidi is violating our gender norms. She doesn't conform to what we think a typical venture capitalist looks like. And that's what we're up against here in my talk and really in much of gender bias that we discuss these days. And that is unconscious bias. It is not about the bad people, in my talk at least, it's not tonight, but it is about good people like you and me who kind of want to do the right thing, but find it too hard to go through with our aspirations. Unconscious bias is what my book is about, and more importantly, it is about overcoming unconscious bias by redesigning how we do things. But let me show you a checkerboard here and ask you a question. I would love for you to compare squares A and B for me. And I presume most of you see square B as being lighter than square A. It turns out this is an illusion, and I'm actually now going to cover the surroundings, and I presume that most of you now see square B and square A as having the same color. I see some incredulous faces, so I'm going to go back just to make sure you do believe me. What was happening here is that your minds made sense of the pattern that you see. You see a checkerboard, and the light square has to be next to a dark square. And of course, you also see that there's a little bit of a shadow, and your minds also control for that shadow. What I'm doing now is literally liberating your minds to be able to see square B for what it really is, another dark square. What I'm suggesting to you is that this is how you also perceive people. You put them into boxes depending on the patterns that we're used to. When you think kindergarten teacher, you do not think men. And when you think engineer, you don't think woman. And therefore, you're surprised if somebody like Heidi is a successful venture capitalist who is also actually a very successful negotiator and network builder. So, what do we do? Let me give you one simple way to literally now, again, liberate your minds to see what really is in front of you. This is research based on quite ingenious and very, very simple design innovation that took place in the 70s in the US major symphony orchestras. They introduced curtains and had musicians audition behind curtains. They did that despite the fact that orchestra directors and selection committees were absolutely sure that they, of all people, only care about the music that is played and not about what somebody looks like. It turns out that the introduction of curtains increased the likelihood that women would advance to further rounds by 50%, increasing the fraction of women from 5% in the 70s to now almost 40% on the 10 major orchestras in the US. This is design. This is the power of design, which changes outcomes really without changing mindsets. Right? These weren't enlightened selection committees all of a sudden. These were the same people with the same minds, with the same patterns in their minds, who got a bit of help with a curtain that allowed them to listen to the music that was played. That's where I want to take you tonight, to not just curtains, although I'm a big fan of blind evaluations, but to other similar design features which make it easier for our biased minds to get things right. In fact, let me give you another study on the power of behavioral design that has nothing to do with gender for a moment. This is another topic that is a hot topic these days, and that is ethics. How can we increase the chances that somebody reports or responds ethically? One way we do this, certainly in the United States, is by testifying beforehand that you will say the truth and nothing but the truth. But another way to do this is to sign at the end. When you complete your tax forms, you typically sign at the end that you have completed it correctly. Now, it turns out that is a design question. Should we do it at the beginning, or should we do it at the end? Why do we do it at the end? It turns out this is a researchable question. So some colleagues of mine from the business school and the Kennedy School studied this, both in the laboratory and then with an insurance company, to understand whether, for example, people claim more honestly when they sign in the beginning or at the end. So this is a form that they gave the participants in the laboratory study. They came to the lab, participated in a task for which they earned some money. They also, this is what we typically do in these studies, they normally get a show-up fee, which compensates them for their expenses. Now, the innovation in this study was that participants had to claim expenses. So they had to fill out this form and say, I came from South Boston, traffic was horrible, I had to change the subway twice, et cetera, it's about $10, or $20, or $15, or had to pay for the parking garage, $25, whatever it might be. And then they just tested whether people, this is a random sample of people, who sign at the beginning claim more or less than people who sign at the end, or people who don't sign at all. And what they find is that people who sign at the beginning claim about half as much as those who sign at the end. This is a random sample, so it should be the same amount. And not signing is about in between. Why is that happening? Because when you sign at the end, a bias tends to kick in, which has the beautiful name of self-serving bias, saying that you're starting to justify what you've just reported. And when you sign at the beginning, you're seeing yourself as an honest person. You just signed, and now you're living up to that expectation that you just set for yourselves. They found the same thing with a large insurance company, that people claim much less when they sign first, and they're just doing it now with the first real country, which for obvious reasons doesn't want to be named. That's another design innovation, right? Where you sign is kind of open. We have to sign someplace. And that's, I think, one of the first big insights about design. This is not designing out of the blue. Things have to be in certain order. These chairs had to be arranged in a certain way. This room has to be built in a certain way. You have to sign someplace. The same is true for gender questions. So before I talk about gender, let me leave you with this metaphor. Because I'm sure almost everyone in this room has been in a hotel room where the room key card served two purposes: to open and close the doors and to turn lights on and off. As you might imagine, this little bit of design, a little bit of technology is about 1,000 times more effective in keeping lights off when you're not in the room than any flyer or any moral suasion that the hotel manager might try out on you, even though you do care about the environment. This is about good people like you and me, who do want to do the right thing, but in the moment find it hard to actually follow through. So this is, of course, quite different from the kinds of things that we have been doing in the past. Different from the things that you might have encountered or even implemented in your organizations. So the first part of the book really tried hard to go out for any evidence that I could find on whether any of this is working. Diversity training, leadership training, negotiation training, mentorship, sponsorship, networks. And the biggest insight, the biggest takeaway, sadly enough, is that we collectively tend to throw money at the problem without measuring. So in the US, we're estimating that companies spend about $8 billion a year on corporate diversity training programs. None of them has ever been rigorously measured. And when I mean rigorously, I mean quite literally using the approach that Rob Jensen used in India, where we have a treatment group and a control group, and we give the diversity training to this half of the room, and this half of the room doesn't get the diversity training, and then we measure whether these people afterwards behave differently, are more inclusive, collaborate more with people who look different from themselves, and hire and evaluate based on objective criteria rather than on demographic characteristics. So the first big insight is we don't measure. And if we do, and for that I had to go into schools where diversity training programs had been randomly administered. And I also included reconciliation training programs, for example, in post-conflict countries such as Rwanda, because they're often based on diversity training syllabi, to really understand what works. And sadly enough, the evidence is not encouraging. I have not found a study suggesting that diversity training does anything. Because our minds are stubborn beasts. I have to confess that as a behavioral scientist, I'm not completely surprised by this. We behavioral scientists have been trying to de-bias minds for dozens of years, not focusing on gender or other demographic characteristics, but generally on cognitive biases, sunk cost fallacy, loss aversion, overconfidence, many of the things that those of you who have read any behavioral science will be familiar with. It's very hard to do. Because much of this is unconscious. Even if you now agree to not be biased tomorrow or in a week from now when you see the unusual job applicant or when you evaluate people for promotion in your company, it will be almost impossible for you to live up to it. So diversity training, I don't think, is the answer. It does get better as we kind of look at some of these other interventions. Again, I can't say that I have tons of evidence on any of these because we don't measure nearly enough of whether our leadership trainings, for example, do anything because we typically don't randomly assign leadership training, right? It is the high potential people who then also get the training and then we clap on our shoulders saying, and yes, they were later promoted. When in fact, we might just have picked the high potential people. And if we didn't do anything horrible in our leadership training, and this is somebody, by the way, who does these kinds of trainings, of course, as a Harvard professor, but we don't measure enough. We really do not measure enough. But let me give you one example of where we have some evidence. So on mentorship and sponsorship, my own profession, economists, have actually launched a mentorship program for junior faculty, for assistant professors. And we did so about 12 years ago because the gender gap in promotions to tenure in economics is actually the largest in all the sciences. And what we did was we offered a 2-day training program for women junior faculty members who attended the American Economic Association meetings, which is the world meeting of economists. Given that we are researchers, the rules of the game were as follows. When you applied, you had to agree to participate in a lottery where we would pick 50% of the applicants out of a hat and the other 50% would not get the treatment. So 50% would be chosen, be participating in a training program, the other 50% is not chosen, can reapply next year, but had to agree not only to participate in the lottery, but also to allow researchers to follow them over their life to understand whether this treatment really mattered for the people who had gotten it. And to my knowledge, it's the only randomly evaluated mentorship and sponsorship program. It turns out it worked. It turns out that people who had been receiving the training, academics, were more successful in their careers, had more publications, were more likely to get tenure, had more citations. So that's very good news. I do want to warn you, however, this wasn't a one-off intervention. So many faculty, including myself, are still in touch with their mentees. This isn't, oh, I'm going to talk to you once or take you to lunch once or even do a training with you a day, but it is kind of being with somebody for a very long time, picking up the phone, calling your colleagues, helping somebody edit a paper, in my case, as a researcher. So mentorship, at this point, I think, can work, but it does require kind of real investment of both the mentors and the mentees. So I do think we have to continue many of these. Many of the ones that enable people, particularly the disadvantaged ones, or traditionally discriminated against, to navigate the system more effectively. However, I don't think that any of the ones that you see on my slide here are going to move the needle enough for us to achieve gender equality. So therefore, I want to talk a bit more about design. I want to talk about 3 potential buckets that you might want to pay attention to. One is talent management. A second one is the design more generally of school and work. And then thirdly, I'll talk about possibly the most difficult topic, and that is how to make diversity work. Let me start with some very, very low-hanging fruit, something that you could change tomorrow. It turns out that our companies have actually been quite smart in many departments and have used data quite a bit in many departments, including in marketing. Gendered marketing has been going on literally for decades. And here's just one example. I'm not picking on soft drink companies, but here's one example that will resonate with you. So a few years ago, the soft drink companies, not just Coca-Cola, also Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, Snapple, others, have found that Diet Coke is not bought by men. And that's a researchable question. Maybe men don't care about the calories they consume, maybe they run more, or maybe diet is not their word. That's in fact what the soft drink companies concluded, and so they introduced zero for men. Pepsi, those of you who like Pepsi, will recall that Pepsi introduced Pepsi Max, Maxi for men. Or for the women in the audience, we could also go to Gillette. Venus Gillette is for those of us who prefer pink to blue. I'm not advocating or defending gendered advertisements. I'm just describing that they're happening and that we should learn from them for other advertisements, namely for our job ads. So here's a school that wanted to increase the fraction of men among its teachers because it had learned from a recent OECD report that came out last spring that boys are increasingly falling behind in our schools due to the lack of male role models. About 15% of elementary school teachers are male in the UK, in Switzerland, in the US. And so here's an ad. Looking for a warm and caring teacher with exceptional pedagogical and interpersonal skills to work in a supportive, collaborative work environment. The adjectives that we highlighted are stereotypically associated with women. This ad is going to decrease the likelihood that men will apply. There are a number of really interesting research papers just examining the language that is used in our job ads, controlling for how gendered the job itself is. Right? Is this a job where we look for engineers, stereotypically men, or for nurses, stereotypically women? So controlling for that, how do we describe the job? And it turns out you can substantially increase the fraction of counter-stereotypical applicants if you use more inclusive language. So this is one example, looking for an excellent teacher with exceptional pedagogical skills. Now, I'm not even saying you have to move to number 2, Because your school might say, oh, but the caring and the support is really important. We need that in the ad. But at least I have turned this into a conscious decision process on your part. Because before it was completely unconscious, and the school actually wanted to have more male teachers. So that's very low-hanging fruit, you will rightly say, and it is. So let's move to some higher-hanging fruit. This is particularly challenging because all of us in this room will think that we are superb interviewers. We just feel it, whether somebody fits or not. And I have this somewhat cheesy picture up here to suggest to you that basically everything you see here is wrong. Let me unpack this a bit. First of all, those of you who do panel interviews should stop. Why? Because the 3 people on the panel will not come up with independent assessments of the job candidate. They will influence each other. Lots of research on groupthink, a phenomenon kind of long known in psychology, where groups under bad circumstances, such as in this interview context, come up with actually worse outcomes than if we just had 3 individuals and then aggregate their ratings of the job candidate ex post. So panel interviews is a common practice, I know, when I work with organizations, but not anything that suggests is the right strategy for a company or an organization in any sector to use. Secondly, and this is more of a myth, not something that is wrong, but more of a myth. The myth is that diversity on the evaluation committee itself is going to lead to better outcomes. It really is true what I said before, that is seeing is believing. Your own demographic characteristics hardly matter. It is what you see. All of us will be biased against male nurses, and all of us will be biased against female engineers, almost independent of our own demographic characteristics. I'm happy to engage that question a bit more in our Q&A. It's a bit more complicated than that, but basically the important message really is much more important what you see than who you are. So that's the myth. Then thirdly, and I'm going to kind of course, read a bit much in this picture here, make sure you evaluate your candidates comparatively. Now you all will say, oh, we do that. We always have, 10 finalists, and then we look at them. But here's what I mean. That's based on our own research. You literally should compare each attribute of a candidate across all candidates. You shouldn't go down the list of everything you care about a candidate or, for example, the resume, because you will be impacted by what you read first or what the person told you as a response to your first answer. But you should literally do this comparatively or horizontally. And where you really want to end up is in a structured interview context where you don't use unstructured questions that are random. It might lead to sharing your hobbies and the team you're rooting for and the school you went to. But in fact, you predetermine the questions beforehand, and then you ask those questions of all of your candidates. And ideally, you use big data, in HR often called people analytics, to inform the questions that you want to ask. And then you ask those questions which your data actually tell you are predictive of future performance. So structured interviews are the way to go. And in the book I give you literally a checklist of what does a structured interview look like, how do you think about the questions, you order them, you rank answers, you compare them across all candidates, and you kind of go through the whole thing. But the important thing here really is the word structure. Now, I don't think we will do without interviews in the near future, even though the bad news here is unstructured interviews are likely the worst predictor of future performance. I'm saying that I don't think we'll do away with interviews, and I'm arguing for structured ones because this is actually not new news. Social scientists have known this for about 50 years. And clearly we haven't been able to communicate this to the rest of the world because human beings cling to these interviews. So do them in a structured fashion, and if you can, use a work sample test, which basically mimics the tasks or jobs that you want the person to do in the future. This is not rocket science, not a big surprise, I'm sure, to anyone in this room. Of course, a work sample test is the very best predictor of future performance. Let me give you, in fact, one study. I have to quickly watch the time, but I have to tell you about the study. That resonated with me. Lots of studies evaluated interviews beforehand, but this one I think brings the point home very easily. A few years back, the state of Texas realized that they didn't have enough physicians. And so what they did was that the legislature mandated that the medical schools, the public medical schools in the state, had to increase the accepted applicants. So the medical schools had already chosen all their favorite applicants. In this case, the medical school in Houston had chosen 150 medical school students out of a pool of 3,500, and they were done with the process. It was May, late in the academic year. At which point the state said, you have to add another 50 students, even though you've rejected them beforehand. You have to go back to the pool, find another 51, because we don't have enough physicians. It turns out that so late in the academic year, of course, all the highly ranked students were already snatched up by other medical schools. So they had to go deep into the pool. They had to admit students who were initially ranked between 700 and 800. And they thought catastrophe, destroying the whole education system, everything. But of course, what seemed like a catastrophe lent itself to interesting research, where now we could study whether the 50 initially rejected students, in fact, performed worse in medical school and post-medical school compared to the 150 top-ranked candidates. And you know where I'm going? No difference. Zip. Which then, of course, raises the question, whoa, clearly our system here is broken. So here's the system. About a quarter of the evaluation depends on what you might want to call more objective measures. So that's previous grades, letters of recommendations, things of that sort. 3/4 are due to interviews, unstructured interviews. When you take out the rating from the interviews, at least there's a little bit of correlation between past performance and your grades and future performance in medical school and post-medical school. The interview only added noise, quite literally leading the researchers to conclude that they should do away with the interviews altogether and just use a lottery. So unstructured interviews really don't work. Use work sample tests and structured interviews. As you can tell, this is going to level the playing field and help you choose talent rather than people who look the part, which is also good for gender equality. But of course, many of you will say, well, but it's not really at the entry level. You've just shown us this pyramid. We know that women are coming into the labor force. They're not climbing up the career ladder. So let's look at promotions. Here are 3 quick insights. The first one, again, is pretty basic, but it took us a while to figure it out. It's now called performance support bias. A number of organizations, including MIT, not bashing on MIT, but MIT actually since has learned a ton. But MIT in the 90s was concerned that it might not support its female faculty the same way it supports its male faculty. And so, being MIT, literally they took a measuring rod, went into people's offices, measured office space, laboratory space, research assistants, and pay. And they found performance support bias. Women faculty weren't given the same kind of support as their male counterparts. MIT, since, is measuring everything. They're a leader in academia in data collection to make sure this doesn't happen to them again. So that's, again, I think, actually not so hard to fix, giving everyone equal support. Here's 2 more things that you should think about. And one is what happens in your performance appraisals. There's two practices that are very common, including at Harvard, I'm sad to say. The first one goes as follows. You evaluate yourself, you are an employee in a company, you're asked to evaluate yourself, including giving yourself a rating, and then you submit your own performance appraisal to your manager, who then, of course, is going to be influenced by the rating that you've given yourself. Right? Imagine I have a curve to fit, and the rating scale is from 1 to 10. On average, I can give my employees a 7. Women tend to be less self-confident than men, so they might come back and give themselves a 5. The men might come back, give themselves a 9. As a supervisor, I'm very tempted to downgrade him a little bit, upgrade her a little bit, decrease the conflict that we'll have in the performance appraisal discussions, when in fact I might have given both a 7 beforehand. There's no evidence suggesting that sharing self-evaluation does any good. I don't know where that practice comes from, beautifully called best practice, without ever measuring. And when you do measure and we look at the data, it's not just gender, just differences in self-confidence. There's also certain cultures which aren't used to bragging. And there's other cultures which will remain unnamed, which are more used to bragging. So don't do that. Finally, thirdly, many companies evaluate their employees based on literally the x-axis performance and on the y-axis potential. Where I typically find gender bias is in potential. It's not such a surprise because performance is more easily measurable. It's backwards looking, it's more quantifiable. Potential is where I fill in the blanks with the stereotypes that I have available. And of course, potential also means leadership, somebody who would like to climb up the career ladders, and we're running into the Heidi problem that we discussed earlier. So if you use potential, and that's actually a place where I'm a bit conflicted. If you use potential, at least measure whether you have gender bias. For equally performing people who get the same rating, is there a gender gap in your potential rating? I'm saying I'm a little conflicted here because I am actually a believer that not everything should be based on the past. Right? There are new opportunities, new developments, and somebody might want to change jobs and do something completely different. Even though the person before has been in an engineering role, now he or she would like to assume a managerial role. So I can't really look backwards only. But what I do with organizations that I work with is I decompose potential. What do you mean? Like, oh, I feel it. I'm like, oh, that's worse. Can't do the feeling. What do you mean with potential? Do you mean leadership? What do you mean with leadership? Okay, is it team leading? Is it public speaking? Is it conflict resolution? Just what is it? And so we decompose the whole potential, and we can show that that increases the likelihood that you don't have gender bias. So that's on the later stages. That's about talent management. I know I'm running through this. This just gives you some sense of how you can de-bias talent management and where kind of to look for some of these lower hanging fruits. Now I want to change to a bit of a different topic and talk about a broader kind of redesign of schools and work. And I'm going to start with multiple choice tests. They're prevalent across the world, many countries, but let me talk about a US example here, because in fact it's going to have a happy ending. So this research is based on probably the most important test that American students ever have to take, the SAT, the standardized test which has a multiple choice component. A former student of mine, a doctoral student, Katie Baldiga-Kaufman, wanted to study test-taking behaviors of men and women, and she was in particular concerned about the following. She was aware of dozens of studies showing that women are less likely to take risk than men. Now, if this is true, men and women might differ in how they take this test because it's a risky environment. Why? Most multiple choice tests have some points associated with getting the right answer. So for the SAT, to be concrete, used to be you get 1 point for every right answer. You also, that's also true for most tests, you also were deducted a 1/4 point for every wrong answer. So a little bit of math told everyone that it was rational to guess, even if you didn't know the answer, if you could exclude one of the alternatives. But, of course, risk-loving people will guess earlier than risk avoiders. And if there's this gender gap in willingness to take risk, we should find a gender gap in willingness to guess or volunteer an answer instead of skipping the question. And that's exactly what Katie found. In the laboratory, she could not only ask people to take the SAT, but also add a second round where people were forced to answer all questions, so she could measure what they would have known had they answered. So therefore, she can control for ability and can show that for equally able people, women perform worse than men, substantially worse, because they skip, more likely to skip than to guess. Happy ending, we lucked out that in 2012, the College Board appointed a new chair, David Coleman, who wanted to redesign the SAT, many features of the SAT, and was also open to gender debiasing the SAT. They could have done many things. We studied a number of interventions in the laboratory. In the end, they decided to take away the penalty from wrong answers altogether, basically eliminate risk from this test. At which point, of course, the critiques said, oh my God, this is crazy. You want to measure ability and now you're inviting wild guessing. At which point the answer has to be, we have been inviting guessing by 50% of the population. We're now making it legal for everyone to guess. This is important, sadly enough, because many of these evaluations can turn into self-fulfilling prophecies. I'm going to not talk about this particular study here, but I detail it in the book in how the feedback that our kids at a very early age get, in fact, does affect performance even 15 years later. So we do have to care about stereotypes that we either activate or don't activate in our tests or in the environments that we provide. I do want to quickly say a word about this slide here, because I'm worried that at this point in my talk, you're starting to wonder about these gender differences. And some of you might think, oh yeah, I've known about gender differences in risk-taking for a long time. This is just because of nature. So some colleagues of mine from the University of Chicago were actually trying to study this question, and they were determined to find a very patriarchal society in the world and a very matrilineal society in the world. Now, there's many things different between the two societies that they ended up studying, but the most important one that we're going to focus on right now is that the Khasi in India are matrilineal. This is a Khasi woman with her child. And the Maasai in Tanzania and in Kenya are a very patriarchal and patrilineal society. It turns out that the Khasi women are more risk-loving, more competitive, more competent, and walk ahead of their men. The Maasai, in contrast, behave just like the Brits and the Americans. So it's clearly not just nature. It is also nurture. And here's another example from India. Unbeknownst to most people, India was one of the first countries to introduce quotas. Now, quotas, just to be clear, are not behavioral design. Quotas are regulation, are rules, are laws. But they do have behavioral impacts, and that's what I want to focus on here for a moment. Role models do matter. Again, what we see affects our beliefs. And India amended its constitution in 1993 to reserve a third of village head positions for women. What was beautiful from a research point of view was that the third literally was picked out of a hat and allowed researchers, a number of development economists, to evaluate what difference really makes. They wrote a number of interesting papers on the impact of this, but the one that I want to focus on here is the power of role models. Namely, what they found was that in villages which have been exposed to two village leaders in those a bit more than 20 years now, two female village leaders, mindsets are starting to change and people are starting to associate political leadership with women. So yes, I do believe that minds can change. I'm not saying minds can never change. I don't think the evidence suggests that our minds are changing because I tell you to change or because you go through a diversity training. But they can change through change in our experiences and through change in our behaviors. And there's this feedback loop then that affects my beliefs of what appropriate behavior is and what potential career aspirations for my children are. And that's, in fact, the last paper that was just published in Science, that now for parents, one of the core career aspirations in villages, which have had 2 female leaders, is for their daughters to become politicians. So role models matter in their true flesh, but even on our walls. I am embarrassed to say that at the Kennedy School at Harvard, it is only 11 years ago that the woman here on the picture, Jenny Mansbridge, on your right, realized that of all the portraits of leaders on our walls, exactly 0 were of women. Now, we have 50% female students. It wasn't our conscious intent to signal to our female students that they're not made to be leaders. In the meantime, we have exchanged some of these portraits. This is Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the president of Liberia, also a graduate of the Kennedy School, to make sure that everyone has somebody to quite literally look up to. Now, here's the good news. At a point when you're starting to fall asleep, yes, even Star Wars has female leaders now with Rey. But you do know that this is going to be followed by bad news. You will recall that Monopoly created a special version of Monopoly based on this particular episode of Star Wars and forgot to include the female characters. Monopoly has since corrected this mistake. I'm using the example just to suggest to you, this is really deep. So let me turn to my last topic, and that is designing diversity. It's also probably one of the hardest ones for us to deal with. So yes, there is evidence on the business case that it is just smart policy and smart business to include 100% of the talent pool. But we're up against the fact that diverse teams will typically report to you that diversity is really hard work. It is hard work because we're experiencing exactly what we want to experience, and that is, we want these teams to disagree. We want them to have real debate and dialogue and not just run in the same direction. But you've all been in those difficult situations where people from very diverse backgrounds disagree on issues, and it's really unpleasant and hard, and it takes time, and by an ungodly hour, you're still there. That's diversity. So yes, there's a macroeconomic business case for diversity, but real diversity actually is really hard work. So I can't promise you that my book is going to offer the silver bullet on that one. But let me give you some hints. One is an old one. Yes, critical mass matters. If you're the only one, the only woman, the only man, the only economist, the only Swiss, whatever you might be, in a team, you will be a token. And you will be asked about, so how do the Swiss feel about this? And you're like, I'm not here to talk. I'm actually kind of here because I'm a behavioral economist. So yeah, so tokens do matter. So you have to have critical mass. It's roughly about 1/3 or 3 people in a team. But it's not just a numbers game. So we shouldn't fool ourselves, but it does matter how we design the teams and how we work together. Let me give you just one example here, and that is political correctness, which I have to confess came as a bit of a surprise to me. Political correctness now has been shown by a number of experimental studies to increase the performance of teams. Why is that? So let me give you 2 images here. You have a clean beach on the right-hand side and a dirty beach on the left-hand side. And my question to you is this: where would you be more likely to drop a piece of paper? Now ask yourself, where would you be more likely to drop a dirty joke? That's what PC does for us. And by changing norms of behavior, eventually can actually affect our experiences, how we perform, and hopefully, eventually, our mindsets. So many of us are norm entrepreneurs, and there is much interesting evidence suggesting that we have changed norms in many dimensions. So think smoking or think littering. This is like a generation. In a generation, we don't even drop a piece of paper when nobody sees us. Norms have really changed. So what are some insights into what's important for norm entrepreneurs? A very simple one is, whatever you want to communicate has to be simple, salient, and going back to my earlier example, comparative. So for you able to calibrate and put into perspective. So you now wonder, what's this pyramid? Those of you who've never lived in the United States might not be familiar with this. This is how the US government has been trying to educate its citizens for about 3 dozen years about healthy eating. So here's the deep insight, just between you and me. We do not eat off pyramids. So this is the new design. And the US government now shows a plate. And it is so easy to understand. And all of you probably will have a favorite, as mine is dairy. I'm a big dairy lover. Can't be so small. Right? Literally, they must have the evidence wrong. I would never have been able to do that from the pyramid. So that's how we change norms in also communicating them more effectively. I'm just going to jump over this and end with an example from the UK. The UK has been engaged in norm entrepreneurship in the last, for a long time, but particularly in my example, for the last 5 years. As you probably are aware, the UK has managed to increase gender diversity on its corporate boards and the FTSE 100 companies from about 12.5% in 2011 to more than 25% at the end of last year, without introducing quotas. But instead, they've really used all behavioral insights that you could imagine. The one that I'm just going to end with here goes back to my introductory example of signatures. It's a simple design feature here where we've been asked to help them think about what behavioral insights could help. And this one is a pretty simple one. So this was the cover brochure that we were presented in 2013, which is the literal cover of the report, showing that at that time, 17% of the board members were female. This is the FTSE 100 sample here, so I'm always focusing on the FTSE 100. Here's why I was concerned. An important behavioral insight is that descriptive norms can turn into prescriptive norms. Describing how the world is can turn into what we think the world should be like. Lots of evidence suggesting that that can happen. And so I was concerned that we might actually confirm the beliefs that we shouldn't have many women on boards. That's just how it is, and that's probably how it should be. So here's a different brochure that was designed by Carrie Conley of the Women in Public Policy program at the Kennedy School, a research center that I direct. And it again focuses on the FTSE 100 companies, so same sample, but we are presenting the information differently. Namely, now we're focusing on the companies which already are diverse, which already have diverse boards. At the time, this was 94% of all companies already had gender diverse boards. And you probably can immediately feel what we're communicating now. We're communicating that the thing to do is to be diverse. And if you're not, you're really an outcast. So that is the power of norms. The UK has done, in addition to kind of the presentation, has done quite a bit, just generally, increasing transparency of data, of our understanding what's going on, and accountability. So of course, it doesn't just stop with presenting evidence, but then we have to go further and hold the people also accountable, for example, to the goals that they set from themselves. If you're interested in learning more about this, read my book, but also visit our webpage here. This is an online platform. This is free, but this is actually a public good that we provided with a lot of enthusiasm, where we translate research for practitioners like all of you, the Gender Action Portal GAP, at Harvard, and I think most all the studies that I discussed today, or many of them at least, can be found on our searchable webpage. And before I wish you good luck designing change, I want to end with a short video clip which summarizes in many ways my talk here, but also hopefully is a tool that you can use, share. Again, it's also publicly available with whomever you'd like.
Let's face it, you're biased. But don't get defensive. We're built to be biased. Does your brain think these squares are different shades of gray? Think again. Your brain took this shadow into account and made assumptions that this square was darker, based on the checkerboard pattern. This natural tendency gives us shortcuts to make sense of our world. The trouble is, these shortcuts, when applied to people, can result in bias. So, how do we avoid unconscious bias to build a better society? Behavioral design offers a new solution to collapse gender inequality in our lifetime. What if we could make it easier for our biased minds to get things right by changing our organizations? For example, in the 1970s, major US orchestras made an ingenious discovery. Adding a simple curtain to the audition process allowed them to listen to the music rather than judge musicians based on their looks. Not only did they acquire better talent, but the fraction of female musicians grew by more than 30 percentage points. Simple solutions like this can also debias our workplace. Simply removing the names on resumes gets a lot of the bias out of the way and allows access to the full talent pool of candidates. And here's some low-hanging fruit. Research has shown comparing candidates to each other, rather than the imaginary stereotypical applicant, calibrates our minds to the best, rather than those who we think look the part. Behavioral designs like these have doubled the fraction of women on the boards of the UK's largest companies in a very short amount of time. Seeing women in leadership, whether in business or politics, changes what people think is possible for their daughters and themselves. In 1993, India mandated 1/3 of seats be reserved for women to serve as elected leaders at the local level. This not only offered new insights into public policy, but also encouraged women to speak up in community meetings. And seeing women work made it more likely for girls in the community to stay in school, marry later, and delay having their first child. Kind of gives weight to the phrase, seeing is believing. Many organizations, including Harvard, have taken this to heart by hanging up more portraits of female role models. Here's what you can do today. Try changing who we look up to on our walls. So, yes, it's time to face it. We're biased, but we can design around it. We have the research and tools to cheaply and quickly redesign how we work, learn, and live. It's not only the right thing, it's the smart thing to do. And now it's up to you.
Thank you very much. We have some microphones, so if you'd like to ask a question, a comment, anything, please do so. I think right there in the yellow.
On women-only shortlists for roles?
Yeah, so it depends on the fraction of the underrepresented groups. So what I mean with that is, a few years back, a number of companies and search firms signed a pledge that they would always include at least one woman on their shortlist, for example, for corporate boards. That doesn't do anything. The one woman is going to be the token and is not going to be taken seriously. So we've actually done experiments on that. It appears that something similar to the critical mass argument that I referred to before matters for shortlists as well, that you need roughly 1/3 of whatever X is, women, men, whatever you're trying to achieve. So don't do too few. Don't just include one. That is going to be an alibi and not really help you much. If you only present women, I don't know. I've never tried that. It's very interesting. I was asked that before. You know, I have no views. I'm a researcher. So I'm not trying to avoid your question, but I'm actually quite serious with my answer. I'm actually quite. There's a fine line between being an advocate and being somebody who is taken seriously as being based on evidence. That's why I honestly report when I don't know. So I think it's actually important for me to be able to say I don't know. Yes, please.
Thank you. Gillian Karen Cumberledge. Do you have any research about how investors look at leaders? So, for example, equity investors, portfolio managers interviewing female CEOs, male CEOs, that some of the attributes of leadership. I'd be interested in how that's influenced. I mean, you've looked at the sort of the selection processes within companies, but there's also the influence of the asset owners. And I just wondered if you'd had any research around how, they're interviewing when they meet female CEOs or male CEOs, and whether there's a sort of a knock-on there as well. I mean, certainly in Silicon Valley, it might be more in Silicon Valley than in the public markets.
So thank you. Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you, kind of for the same reason, but I'm going to explain why. It is not typically, it's not the typical company which would invite me in to evaluate how they interview CEOs, right? So we know very little about that. Companies are actually, it gets harder to understand interviewing and evaluation processes at the top than at the entry level.
But would investors, because arguably for investors...
Do you say universities?
No, investors. So, I mean, I'm just wondering, like, for a really smart hedge fund to get the quality of their interviewing right up and to see whether there's actually, they're missing agenda bias or whatever. And I just wondered if there's any... I would have thought from the capital markets there might be an interest in how this, is playing out. And certainly if you look at, now also diversity is in like LGIM here in the UK, voting against sort of, diversity policies. But specifically whether there was any evidence that how investors are interpreting gender and whether this is influencing how they're investing.
Sorry, yeah. So investors, yes. I kept understanding universities, and then I tried to make sense of the CEOs and the universities, so that's why. Okay, I've only just now got investors, so now I'm catching up on the question. So there is a bit of evidence that investors can play some role. It's not necessarily behavioral, that is pretty incentive, right? This is pretty clearly economic incentives that investors can exert. Honestly, there are not enough investors, I think, actually caring. I mean, there are some who have been out there repeatedly asking the question also at annual meetings of companies, and there has been some pressure, but I don't think we have a critical mass of investors at this point to actually promote enough change. Yes, please, the very front.
My name's Gina Lazenby. I write about the rise of the feminine and have really, really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. Have you done any research about what's known as the glass cliff, when women get to the top, but as CEOs and top leaders are held to a different level of accountability, and what I've read, they're more likely to be sacked or let go of if there's a mistake or something than a male CEO. And Jill Abramson story, when she left the New York Times, there was a lot in the media about that. So I wonder whether you've done any research about that subject.
Mm-hmm. So I have not, but, and certainly there are rumors that might be true, but there is serious research on an experimental basis. Now, these are, of course, not CEOs. They rarely come to our laboratories, although we're working on that. Although, by the way, half jokingly, so one of the benefits of being at an institution like mine, we have executive programs. So one of them I run for the Young Global Leaders of the World Economic Forum, so I do use them as guinea pigs as well. So, it's not actually true what I'm saying. So we now do have access to some CEOs. So it does, yes, so the research does suggest that we don't necessarily hold men and women accountable for the same kinds of things, and that men and women can get away with different kinds of behaviors. And for women, because you asked about CEOs, it goes back to my earlier example of Heidi and Howard, that given that we don't associate leadership with women to start with, If she doesn't behave like a leader, or what we imagine a leader to do, then we are very quickly, very likely to punish her more extremely for that. The same is though true for men in counter-stereotypical roles. So caregiving, if men make a mistake on caregiving, it's like, see, I told you so. Men can't do that. So it really isn't so much about women, it is about people in counter-stereotypical roles, right? And your question about CEOs is women in counter-stereotypical role as CEOs, but again, the evidence suggests the same is true for men if they fulfill some of those counter-stereotypical roles. Did you have a question in the back? Oh, thank you.
I had a question about the political correctness and diversity. That was a fascinating
Yes.
Result. And I'm just wondering about what that means. What are the rules of political correctness? Because it sends a message, certainly my experience has been, that there is a grouping of people like us who come together under those sorts of banners, and that diversity gets a bit sacrificed by this. I'm not saying dirty jokes, but in many ways people feel that difficulty in speaking up. They feel that they should self-censor themselves a little bit. And so the idea that you get better performance out of this is very interesting.
Yeah.
How does that work? Or what are those rules that don't encourage just groupthink of a different level?
Yeah. No, thank you for this question. I fear I'm on slippery ground here because, I mean, I share your concerns. And I also have to confess that as a Swiss, coming from a culture, Germanic culture, which isn't big on PC, initially I came to the US and thought, oh, it's these superficial Americans, of course, and they're still thinking the thoughts. I've since come around because of the studies that I mentioned, but I think what you're alluding to, which I think must be true, is that the devil's in the detail. You know, what does PC really mean? So one organization that I have not been able to evaluate but have observed, for example, which have introduced as PC norms in team meetings have little red flags. And they just raise a little red flag when they think a norm that they previously have agreed on is violated. That includes sexist jokes, I mean some of the obvious things, but also includes things such as evaluating job candidates or candidates for promotion when we use language such as, he is just fantastic, and when we talk about her, we're saying, she has great talent. So then the red flag would go up. Now they spent actually time defining the rules of engagement. And they started with kind of what does PC mean for us? What are the kinds of things that we think should be allowed in our discussion? And what are the kind of things that we want to rule out now? And whenever we violate those and fall back into our old patterns, we'll raise that flag. Again, I've only observed this. I don't have evidence in that one, but I imagine that's the way we need to go collectively. As in taking group processes really seriously and thinking about what kind of dynamics would make each of us feel comfortable in being heard. So another thing, for example, they do is if you've just asked a question and then I go back to the lady in the front of the room and said, I think that was a brilliant question that you just asked. I mean, love to talk more about you after the meeting. So not attributing comments to the appropriate people, that was another rule that they had. It was speaking time, so they really went into lots of details of some of the gender dynamics in particular that we typically find in teams and created norms around those. So that's the kind of experiment that I'd love to run, kind of see what, but I think at this point we don't know what the optimal number of kind of rules of engagements are for teams to work better, but based on the evidence that I suggested to you, my answer must be a more conscious approach to team interactions, whether you want to call this political correctness or some other form where we overcome those gender biases in our interactions and find a behavioral type of interventions which is non-intrusive, such as the little red flag or something like that, which is not going to disrupt the whole meeting. I cannot imagine that that's not productive based on what I've seen. Okay. I think we're out of time. Yeah, I'm getting the signal here. Okay, fine. Oh, no, you're the boss. Okay, let's take two more final questions. Yes, please.
Thank you very much indeed for that presentation. So I've got a little daughter who's 2.5, and I've got a little son that's 9 months old, and it drives me as a father nuts that she might grow up in a world that's less equal, less opportunities for her than him. So, two questions. Number one, as a father, is there anything that I should be doing to make sure that she does grow up with that self-confidence and risk-taking, etc.? And second question is, do you think by the time they enter the workforce in 16, 17 years' time, that what will the landscape look like? Will this be a sort of a problem solved?
Yeah, thank you very much. Sadly enough, I don't think anyone, including me, can ever answer the question, what part of the gender dynamics that we're seeing is due to nurture and what part is due to nature. I imagine there's truth to both. Some must be nature, some must be nurture, and certainly the matrilineal society that I described to you suggests that some must definitely be nurture. When we look at research on gender stereotypes and when they develop, it appears as if they develop between 4 and 6 years old. And the evidence that I'm thinking of is actually a relatively basic experiment, but I think actually a very sad or scary one. And that is an experiment where they gave kids little wooden puppets, which were completely gender neutral. And one of them was kind of a bit hunched, a bit small, and the other one was kind of in a power pose. And then a 4-year-old kid would describe these two puppets as small, weak, scared, and powerful, big, tall, something like that. When you give those puppets to a 6-year-old, the 6-year-old will say, woman, man. So something happens at that time. Is it exposure to media? It's one possible culprit. Really good research done by the Gina Davis Institute, for example, on cartoons and what are stereotypical cartoon characters. So think about Star Wars again. I know it's not a cartoon, but think about Star Wars again. So now getting to your second answer, be really attentive to the kinds of things that your children engage with. So what books do they read? What picture books do they read or watch or look at? What films do they watch? What cartoons do they watch? One thing that had never occurred to me, had never noticed before, that I learned from the Gina Davis Institute is that, and you might want to pay attention to that, whenever we see crowds of people in films or in cartoons, generally the gender composition appears to be 2/3 men and 1/3 women. Why? I have no idea why we wouldn't show 50% boys and 50% girls. But they have done a really impressive meta-analysis, kind of going through content and kind of showing this. So that's what I try to do with my boys, thinking very hard about the kinds of exposure that they get, also taking them to see counter-stereotypical role models. But seeing is believing, so you can't correct for everything. Now, your second question is, what's going to happen in 20 years from now? So I don't know. We've certainly seen, so I'm going to go back, so I'm not going to do potential, so I'm going to do a performance, going to go back. We've certainly seen kind of two trends, which are a bit maybe concerning. One is gender segregation in jobs kind of continues. We have seen, that's the second trend, that women increasingly take on stereotypically male jobs. So we see more female engineers than we saw 50 years ago. But what we haven't seen is men taking on stereotypically female roles. And that's actually a huge issue. Those of you who read The Economist might recall they had a long series last spring, particularly on that particular issue, because those jobs, particularly blue-collar male jobs, are dying out. Certainly in our part of the world where we're in right now. And these men haven't learned yet to become nurses or caregivers, even though we all know that the biggest sector that is going to explode in the next 20 years is the care economy. So, it's very hard for me to say. We're seeing some change. We certainly see that, based on surveys, that the millennials, including men, seem to care more about work-life balance than we've ever seen before. And that suggests to me that maybe we'll open a black box that my book has very little to say on, that I think very few people have anything to say on. That's the black box of the household. For real gender equality, eventually we'll have to have gender equality at home as well, not just at work. And maybe the millennials will take us there. Don't know. Last question.
Hi. It was really interesting what you were saying about the panels and potentially getting rid of panels. I was wondering if you'd done
panels
for recruitment.
Yes,
sorry.
perfect. Yeah. Just after my university thing, I'm like a little.
Yeah. And I'm from a university,
now to my
so
hearing.
So I was wondering if you'd done any control research to see whether telephone interviews produced a more or less biased effect to a face-to-face interview. So you're putting the curtain in the interview room in effect. So if you're moving from a panel to an individual one-on-one, and it's what we're looking at King's University, we're trying to look at gender, but also the intersection with race. We'd also want to look at age and disability and things like that. And if you can't physically see the person, you can't start looking at the intersections as well. You'd know the gender, but you wouldn't be able, and with male candidates, you wouldn't be able to look at intersections either. So I was just wondering if you'd done anything around that. And if you'd compared it also with a blind shortlisting to see if there was a double effect. You'd got more people through then, plus never seen them interview. Because do you see in interview situations, you want to see someone to look at the fit within the organisation? Do we physically need to see somebody before we hire them?
Yep. Just lots of questions in your question, but maybe let me just give you a holistic answer and then go into a bit more specifics. I mean, the first answer I have to give you is an appeal to all of you who have power in organizations or in HR departments to measure what's going on to allow people like me to answer your question. This is not just a joke, but honestly, companies, which is very interesting, defies the purpose a little bit, who should care about the bottom line and of course do care about the bottom line and would never base their financial decision making, even their marketing on intuition, think about people management somehow differently. It's very intuition-based and it's just not much guided by evidence. So we need to do much more to really be able to answer your question. Now, the little evidence that we do have is quite encouraging, that the blind evaluations, and that's of course beyond the telephone interview because I can hear your voice, and so I might be able to determine not just your gender, your class, even your race, your nationality. There's lots of things that go with your language. So I have no evidence suggesting that that's actually a big improvement. But there is evidence that blindness is going to level the playing field and increase the fraction of underrepresented groups. Now, my last word, I'm actually going to put in a good word for, I think, some very interesting startups which will change how we do this quite dramatically. I'm aware of 6 right now. I mean, my book has now brought me all those people. I didn't know all of them beforehand, but let me just mention the UK one. There's a new startup called Applied, really trying to make it easier for organizations to do the kinds of things that I discussed here in talent management. So providing the software to companies to do structured interviews, to do work sample tests, to scrutinize your job advertisements for non-intended exclusion of certain groups. So I think that's where we have to go, and then we have to use, I'm excited about them, A, because they will help translate what I just described to you for the final users, but also B, because already they are measuring everything. They are constantly A/B testing the new technology and what works better and what increases the talent pool that people really draw on. So maybe eventually they'll do, I don't know, voice on recognition. My English is starting to fade. But you know what I mean. Maybe there's going to be, and maybe we will find this completely artificial and we will kind of not want to engage with it, right? So, but the beauty, I think, of the new technology is that they'll allow us to experiment and really learn what works and what does not. With that, thank you very much.